you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I have Rod with me today, and we're going to be talking about the insurance industry and probably some of the rehab that needs to happen around our image outside of our theoretical four walls. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, can you give everybody an introduction?
Sure. My name, as you mentioned, is Rod Hughes. I'm the president of Kimball Hughes Public Relations. And I spent 10 years as a journalist covering the legal and insurance industries before I turned to the dark side and became a public relations professional. That's where I've spent the last 21 years, speaking primarily with B2B businesses, some B2C, but where we've specialized as an agency is in the insurance industry. And that's really where our team spends a lot of time talking about the broad issues and implications of the insurance industry's reputation, both among ourselves, with journalists, as well as with our clients. And that's why I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Well, thank you for joining me. And when we were prepping for this conversation, you used a quote, and forgive me, you're going to have to tell everybody who the quote actually came from because I just wrote it down and didn't write down the source. I, however, was not a journalist. But it's this idea that if you can't convince them, confuse them. And how does that play into our perception and the way that like insurance is viewed from the outside?
Well, I think that's the perception of the consumer writ large, whether it is small business owners, whether it is individual policyholders, home, auto, even if you are a larger business looking at your general liability policy. That quote, which is from former US President Harry Truman, really kind of sums up that perception. And you got the quote exactly right. It is simply, if you can't convince them, confuse them. And the reason I think this applies is if you think about insurance in the abstract, as most consumers do, there's volumes of paperwork you receive, even if it's a simple renter's insurance policy. Don't even get me started on more complex cyber policies, et cetera. Then there's the policy language itself, which is confusing. How often do you find yourself sitting down in a coffee shop talking about aggregate limits, named perils, endorsements, subrogation for policies? These are terms that real humans don't use in the day-to-day. And as a result, it's unfamiliar when we face it in these documents, in these insurance conversations. And then there's also when you submit a claim. The reality is most of us believe we know what our coverage is. Then we submit a claim and we find out, perhaps in some instances, we're not covered for what we thought we were. And why is that? It's because of volume of paper. It's because of the language. And it's because the process of securing insurance can be so complex. So we think we know what we have, and then we're surprised when we don't have what we think we were covered for. I kind of equate it to insurance is from Venus and insureds are from Mars. There's not a common language or a shared appreciation of one.
I think one thing I actually saw a TikTok video about this idea earlier today that came to mind as well is that there's also this like weird convoluting of health insurance and all other insurance and how it functions. And like when you're talking about your policy language and those types of things, on the health insurance side, people are used to things being covered or not, and like maybe having an appeals process and working through like experimental treatments. And like everybody has that and uses that more frequently and more regularly, hopefully, than they're filing claims for like property damage or casualty or anything along those lines. And so I feel like there's also some of our reputation is maybe like convoluted with all of those types of things and the way that those agreements work on the health insurance side in comparison to what it's like to purchase insurance out on the market. So I think that there's not only like the confusion around like the language and those types of things and how we operate, but also then kind of a related but slightly separate industry in terms of how we function and the way that people have purchasing decisions in front of them when it comes to purchasing insurance. So let's talk, we know the problem. I think most people that are in our industry know where we're situated and what people think. I could go into a diatribe of the different things that I've heard over the last number of years after moving into the insurance industry. But let's talk now a little bit more about like what are some of the solutions that we have available to us to start shifting the narrative surrounding the industry.
Sure. Well, insurance is not a frictionless undertaking, and we all know this. So, our job, whether we are advising insurers on the communication side, the marketing side, or the sales side, is to find ways to limit that friction. And one of the key ways, and I'd love to tell you that I'm covering new ground here, but these are the tried and true things that should be done, but often aren't done well. The first is educating. We have to educate insurance consumers. And I believe that starts at the high school and college level for two reasons. One, it helps the industry with recruitment. We have a severe talent shortage that is only getting worse year after year. Secondarily, most insureds, their first experience with insurance, if you think about it, probably yours was the same as mine, is when we get our driver's license. And suddenly our parents tell us how very expensive the insurance is to allow us to drive. And that is that first experience. It's usually, I know my parents were very upset about how expensive it was. They impressed that upon me. They impressed the fact that this would be a detriment to me if I had an accident because everything would go up. It's always presented in the negative. So I think we have to educate consumers and meet them where they are now, which is through social media, online content, trade media, news media, and as I said, in high schools and colleges. We can grow an entire batch of insurance consumers or a next generation of insurance consumers if we take the time and effort to do this. We also have to be clear and transparent. I talked about language earlier, and really we have to let go of the insurance jargon. We have to learn to speak to people like they're human beings and not a sales transaction. We have to anticipate real world questions that real world consumers would have and give them plain spoken answers. That's one of the biggest problems in the insurance space is, as you mentioned with healthcare, it's so convoluted. It's so complicated when you're looking at health insurance policies, life insurance policies, general liability policies, cyber policies, that most people get overwhelmed. And at a certain point, they stop asking questions because they're just going to go on faith that their agent or their broker is giving them what they need. So we have to be more clear so that people really understand what it is they're buying. Because as a consumer, if you understand what you've purchased and you know the benefit of it, you're probably going to embrace that purchase opportunity more. And then we have to acknowledge really what insurance is. It's a for-profit industry. And this is something that I feel very strongly about. Insurance shouldn't pretend to be something it's not. It is for profit. There are ample opportunities. Insurance does incredible things with philanthropy. It does incredible investments in being a good community citizen or corporate citizen. It gives back in tremendous ways in the billions of dollars. We work with the Insurance Industry Charitable Foundation. They rank philanthropy in the insurance industry, and the numbers are staggering each and every year. Their employees give back to their local communities, the companies give back, and they ultimately, insurance is really there to help you. So we shouldn't skirt the issues of capitalism. That's our society. But we have to talk about stories where insurance companies and insurance organizations help their insureds, whether it's making claims, whether it is being proactive, identifying risks and mitigating them before they become issues, which helps protect all of us as insurance consumers. And we need to highlight that philanthropy and that community service.
So, not to be like devil's advocate here, but
Sure.
I don't think any of what you just listed are things that haven't been talked about before.
They're not.
And you and I had this conversation. We know what the solution is. But why the hell aren't we doing it? Like why aren't we seeing any of these things actually take place?
Because it's in the DNA of the insurance industry. Insurance, by its nature, is risk averse. And so are some of the leaders in the insurance industry. Talking differently about insurance in ways we haven't done before, or we haven't done consistently, is an unknown variable, and it's scary. When you've got stockholders to report to, when you've got numbers to make, when you have payroll to make. For some insurers, it is a risk to their business to take a different approach. And also, insureds have allowed it. You and I, as insurance consumers, have allowed it. Have you ever picked up the phone and called your agent, your broker, your captive insurance provider and said, I don't understand what I purchased, so I'm not going to buy your policy because you weren't clear?
I have not.
Neither have I. Neither of us have the time, effort, or energy. We know enough to be dangerous, probably a little bit more than your average consumer, and we're taking it as an article of faith that we have. But we're allowing the industry to speak to us, to use language in ways we don't entirely understand. And it's just how our parents did it. It's how their parents did it. So we've allowed it. So I think consumers have an obligation to push back a little bit and say to the insurance companies, speak to me in practical terms. Let's talk like we're at a coffee shop and we're good friends instead of you trying to sell me something. And I think insurers would be willing to do that. It's just they're afraid to try something different. And then for more years than I care to count, insurance has positioned itself to consumers as this thing that will help you when the bad thing happens. That is a terrible sales proposition. If you're buying something that's only going to be applied or used when the worst thing you can imagine happens to you, are you really excited about that purchase? Do you really feel good about that purchase? No, most of us purchase insurance and hope we never have to use it. So it's not the best environment. So I think that's one of the additional reasons why people kind of stick to doing it the way it's always been done. But I think one of the solutions is insurers need to be bold. They need to be plain spoken, and increasingly, that's what consumers want, especially the younger insureds that are coming into the market. They don't want to be confused, they want to be convinced. And that's really important to them. And a great example of this, a great example of consumers pushing businesses to talk differently is the Burger King ad that just came out recently, where they show their rotting burger. I think it's over a video, time-lapse video over 34 days. And they show a Burger King burger of some kind that slowly rots. And the proposition is, because fast food has this reputation of being loaded full of preservatives and not very good for you, not really food, they decided to say, no, we have no artificial preservatives. And regardless of your position on Burger King, personally, I'm not a fan. I think the ad campaign is brilliant because it shows consumers that it's a real food item. It's not loaded with preservatives. And yeah, it's a hard video to watch. If you're a burger lover, it may kind of turn you off, but it's talking about their business and their product in a very different way that consumers aren't used to. It's bold, it's eye-catching, and it's unexpected. And I think the insurance industry should really take note.
And there are some examples of campaigns that have kind of positioned some of what we're talking about.
Sure.
But like we were talking about while we were prepping for this, I would love to see a carrier buy a Super Bowl spot and have somebody sit down and have a 30-second honest conversation with consumers. It might not be like as catchy as a gecko or any of the other mascots that I could mention, because every single one of them has somebody. But the difference is it would be so different that it would get people talking. And it would be something that would make people stand up and start paying attention to that carrier, and the fact that they're not hiding from the fear associated with it, of coming out and stepping out and saying something different and approaching, like you said, admittedly, like a really touchy subject. Because I can only imagine the types of comments based off of what I've seen when I put stuff out there about the insurance industry, what I see on my own little tiny social media accounts in comparison to what happens to these large brands when they're putting stuff out there online, or a segment in a really, like the Super Bowl or wherever it might be, the kind of information that they get back on a day-to-day basis, they think opening that can of worms is going to make it 10 times worse. But they'd actually probably see a little bit of the reverse. They'd still have plenty of that, but it would be no different than any other ad campaign that they've ever run. But then they might actually have the opportunity to start to right that ship and eventually start to change the mentality surrounding our industry?
I think you're exactly right. I think they have to start the conversation somewhere because it's very clear as the consumer public is looking to point, click, and buy that they see insurance as a commodity. Really are, they're not fans. Some folks, younger folks, think that they may be able to get away with having certain types of insurance. And I think the industry has to rethink that conversation. And it's worth the risk. It's worth taking a little, for lack of a better term, a little bit of flack uh, for doing things differently if it broadens the conversation. And if they plan their communication strategy accordingly, they can message around. It doesn't have to be this crisis that needs to be managed. Instead, it can be the beginning of the conversation, and they could position themselves as thought leaders in the space uh, in a way that consumers, I think, will embrace. There's no product company out there that is 100% loved and adored by the consumer audience. Insurance certainly doesn't suffer that problem, and I think that has to be recognized. Bake it into your plan and have those thoughtful conversations because that's what the younger consumers are. They want to be communicated to differently. And everybody's scrambling to try to figure out how to do this. And I think sometimes the best way to do it differently is to be transparent, to be clear, to be honest and forthright. What are you buying? What are the advantages to you? What does it mean for you? And how can you provide it to you? That's a great conversation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for the discussion. For anybody that's not, make sure that you get connected with Rod and certainly reach out to either one of us if you've got questions or want some help brainstorming any ideas on how to start to kind of shatter this poor perception that we have and start righting the ship. But thank you again for your time, and thank you everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Ed.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.